Some 222 days have passed since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian forces have continued to defend and fight back and recapture the key eastern town of Lyman over the weekend. Now, this marked a major gain for Kyiv after Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the annexation of 4 areas of occupied Ukraine in the largest forcible annexation of land in Europe since 1945. Now, democratic governments around the world, including South Korea, do not recognise this annexation, of course, and continue to back Ukrainian forces against Moscow's continued aggression. And the recapturing of Lyman, which is within the territory of Putin's declared annexation, has given rise to hopes of further Ukrainian gains in the weeks to come, according to NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg. We now discuss the latest developments today and invite Dr. Valery Dzutsati, visiting assistant professor of political science at the University of Kansas. And we also have Dr. CRONIN, Asia-Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, to get started on the questions, this question goes to both of you, but let's start with you, Dr. Dzutsati. Now, Ukraine recaptured Lyman, and that's a key logistics hub in the eastern Donetsk region. Now, how significant is this gain, and does it provide a positive outlook for the Ukrainians?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. So taking Lyman is the second such event in recent weeks when Ukraine countered the Russian invasion by retaking part of its territory, and this is the first time. So the first time it happened in Kharkiv, of course, if we don't count Kyiv. And the first time the Russian propaganda dismissed the event, it was like a regrouping, it was something else. It did not recognize the loss. But this second time, so one time it could be an accident, but it's unlikely there are 2 accidents in a row. So this time, actually, even the official Russian propaganda and the Russian Ministry of Defense recognized this loss. Which is a very significant event for the Russian domestic audiences, basically. Yeah, so I would expect that this is likely to change the overall climate, in informational space in Russia overall, which is very important.
And how do you see this, Dr. CRONIN? Would you agree with that analysis? Do you think it casts a positive outlook for the Ukrainians?
I think it's very clear that the Ukrainians have established through this counteroffensive new momentum, not just in Lyman, but I think the breakthrough today in the southern region of Kherson shows that they're continuing to run with the ball. They know that they've got the higher morale, they know they're well armed, and that they're pushing back the Russians right now, who are in disarray, at least in part of the front. So, Moscow may use some of these setbacks to justify more indiscriminate force, but at the moment, Ukraine has established the momentum.
And Dr. Dzutsati, now, Ukrainian soldiers, of course, they continue to fight bravely with very high morale, as Dr. CRONIN just said. But how are Russian troops faring at the moment, Dr. Dzutsati?
Yes, that's a great question. So, about 2 weeks, a bit less than 2 weeks ago, President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, announced partial mobilization. And so up to 300,000, and some people say up to 1,200,000 reservists should be called up and serve and be sent to the front lines. And that mobilization actually had a negative impact on the public mood in Russia, as many young men started fleeing the country. A lot of points, like border points, were jammed because of the fleeing young men. So I would say that there are people, of course, who willingly go to fight. There are those too, but from what we can see, there isn't like a very wide public support for this war, especially as at the time when people have to actually chip in and participate themselves in this war, or their relatives and friends.
Right, and let's not forget Russia is still calling this a special military operation. So, yes, it looks like the Ukrainians high morale on that side. And Dr. CRONIN, now, the Russian Constitutional Court on Sunday, they recognized the treaty signed by President Vladimir Putin to annex 4 Moscow-occupied regions of Ukraine. And while UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, he said that this annexation would violate the UN Charter and that it has no legal value. And of course, he, along with other major democratic governments, have refused to accept it. But a resolution calling to condemn the referendums, that was vetoed by Moscow. So is there much that the global community can really do to stop the Kremlin right now?
Well, there are things that can be done and that are being done to at least slow down, to punish, to penalize what Russia's doing here in terms of aggression. We live in an anarchical society. We don't have the law and order internationally that we have domestically in our countries. Part of the price of setting up the UN Security Council originally after World War II was allowing the permanent 5 members to have a veto. So, of course, Russia can veto the UN Security Council resolution condemning it. But the UN still matters. It's still the arbiter of legitimacy. And so when UN nations condemn Russia, when they sanction Russia, that does matter. And it puts pressure on Moscow to desist, to make a deal, to make peace. Not enough yet to do that, not in the wake of immediate force being used on the ground in the battlefield. But it does highlight that this military fiasco and economic disaster that Putin has launched, and he tries to sell as a holy war back in Russia, really is unsustainable and will not prevail.
And Dr. CRONIN, now Putin yet again and his officials too, they've threatened the use of nuclear weapons. And while your country, Washington, now it's said that it's going to respond decisively, and it's told Moscow that it's going to face catastrophic consequences if it decides to cross this line. But how do you see the possibility of nukes being used? And do you think Putin is serious, or do you think he's just attempting at deterrence here?
Well, we take it very seriously, of course, because Putin is in charge. He may have no checks and balances on him, and he has a formidable arsenal, including a lot of nuclear weapons. But nuclear weapons make better threats than they do instruments for advancing actual political goals. So in his desperation to regain the initiative, to slow down Ukraine, he could grasp for a tactical, so-called battlefield tactical nuclear weapon. But that it's the threat of nuclear weapons that kind of restrains NATO from intervening. The use of a nuclear weapon, no matter even how limited, would definitely trigger more US and I think NATO member intervention to stop Russia.
And Dr. Dzutsati, now Ukraine formally applied for NATO membership, and the bid was backed overwhelmingly on Sunday by 9 Central and Eastern European NATO countries. How do you think this kind of move will impact the war in terms of, well, do you think it's going to expand it further or even make it become potentially nuclear?
So in my point of view, we can see that the response on the NATO countries' part was mixed, right? Some countries vigorously supported that, specifically Eastern Central European countries, while West European countries' reaction has been kind of muted. So accepting Ukraine into NATO at this time would mean war between NATO and Russia, because there is Article 5, then NATO countries would have to defend one of their members as their own territory, which would quickly escalate into God knows where. So I don't anticipate this happening unless some nuclear, maybe Russia uses nukes, which, as the previous speaker said, is not very likely, and I agree with that. So I think NATO countries will provide support to Ukraine, short of accepting it, at least during the wartime. Perhaps after, most likely after the war is over, but not very soon.
And Dr. Cronin, Moscow's closest friends, China and India, they chose to abstain rather than vote against the resolution that condemned the Kremlin's latest actions in Ukraine. What do you think what do you think will be their position going forward, particularly when it comes to China?
Well, it's a great question because China has wanted to play it both ways. They want to support the UN Charter, supposedly, but at the same time, they're essentially giving a lot of diplomatic leeway for Russia's special military operation, invasion of Ukraine. I think the
Sorry, it seems that the video and
common
audio
interest.
has frozen there. If you could just go over that again, Dr. Cronin. Sorry
Yes,
about that.
I'm sorry. You know, China is trying to leverage cooperation on Russia for other policy objectives over Taiwan and elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific. They shouldn't be doing that. They should be making sure that the UN Charter doesn't take a backseat to power politics, because war with major powers is too important to be leveraged for other issues. And I think that's the key issue here from Washington's perspective, looking for China to get serious about constraining Russia. They're talking about diplomacy. They've always quietly talked about diplomacy from the beginning to show a certain even-handedness on the Russian invasion. They've been talking more as Russia's had setbacks, but this is the time for Beijing to step forward and cooperate to put an end to this war.
And Dr. Cronin, do you think, well, perhaps China saying that, suggesting it could be a mediator in this or trying to keep a neutral position, do you think it's its way of maybe just dodging the issue itself? And I mean, where do you think Xi Jinping really stands on this? Does he want the war in Ukraine to end quickly, or what do you think is really on his mind?
Yeah, well, who knows what's on Xi Jinping's mind? Maybe the 20th Party Congress at the moment. But I believe that he really wants to play it both ways. He really does like the idea of having Moscow as a pole in the multipolar world to stand up against a U.S.-led rules-based order. But as Russia has had setbacks and has even risked further escalation and widening this war and widening the economic impact, I think Xi Jinping has been leaning a little bit more and more toward trying to find an end to this conflict.
I see. And Dr. Dzutsati, now November, it's going to be a critical time for Ukrainian and Russian troops as the weather's going to shut things down for both sides. Now, how do you see both sides moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of folks are suggesting that there will be a pause over the winter. I don't understand really why they expect that, because on the other hand, Russian partial mobilization, the troops will be the first combat ready troops are expected approximately by the start of the winter. So I don't think they will just sit out and wait until winter, ends. I don't really anticipate lengthy pause. Maybe there will be some tactical pause, but I don't anticipate a lengthy pause over the winter time, unfortunately. So I'm afraid we'll see more fighting.
And Dr. Dzutsati, I bet you get asked this question over and over again, but what do you think Vladimir Putin, what do you think the end game is for him right now with the turn of events as well? At what point do you think he would be willing to concede?
So from what we know about Putin, he's very careful not to get into a bad story like we are seeing in Ukraine. But once he gets into a story like this, he has to press ahead until he cannot press ahead anymore. So I would say until it is clear on the battlefield that Russia cannot go anywhere, forward, anywhere then. Until then, we'll see, I'm afraid, more and more war. So I'm afraid at this time, we can only hope that Russian big allies or semi-allies, such as China, especially, and India, until then, they, say something decisive, which is also not very likely at this time. but potentially plausible under certain circumstances. Until then, I'm afraid we'll see more war. So there is no end game. There is no good end game for Putin, I would say. Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid this is where we have to wrap up the interview today, but that was Dr. Valery Dzutsati, Visiting Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Kansas, and Dr. Patrick CRONIN, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Thank you both so much for your insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.